for having me, and thanks everyone for making the time today. I'm going to run through just a few slides here and certainly want to leave time at the end for questions because I know this is an area where there are a lot of questions and kind of diving into some specifics can make sense. Um, Through the slides, what I'm just hoping to provide is at a high level, kind of a picture of the landscape that we have right now when it comes to immigration enforcement. And I apologize in advance, but I don't know that I'm going to be able to sit here and tell you all the answers and exactly how to prepare for every situation. But I hope that by giving a picture of that landscape and understanding the types of visits you might see, the types of things that might go on, and just sort of a broad framework for what immigration enforcement might look like. It can help you prepare and think through how this might apply in your own circumstance. So just at a high level, a few different topics that we're going to cover here. I want to start by talking about the different types of immigration visits that you might have at your business or just you might see out in the community. And there are, we talk about ICE, and that's kind of what grabs the headlines in the news. But just understanding the different types of visits, I think, can help to sort of contextualize exactly what's happening in a particular case. And then, as you might expect, we'll spend some time talking about what happens if you do have an ICE encounter. And in this sense, I really mean an ICE enforcement action where someone is trying to enter your business or look for a particular person. And we'll talk about where ICE officers are allowed to be, where they're not allowed to be, and what you can do as a business owner or even just as a community member to prepare for that in advance. I'll then spend a little bit of time talking about guidance for visa holders. And this may apply to you directly, it may apply to people that you know, but just to kind of quickly think through some of the guidance that we have out right now about things like visa processing, international travel issues, and electronic device searches. So with all that, I guess we'll just jump right in here and start by thinking about the different types of immigration agents that you might see kind of out in the world. And the point here really is that many of these government visits, even though they are immigration focused, are not really a cause for concern and are not really the type of headline grabbing ICE visits that we all sort of have in mind. So first is the USCIS, which is the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. They have a unit called the Fraud Detection and National Security Directorate, which is the FDNS. And essentially what they do is they verify compliance with visa programs. So if you have someone on a work visa, FDNS can show up at the work site and they can say, hey, we see that you have this person on a work visa. We'd like to verify that they're actually working in the job that you described. They're actually here at this work site. And so that's really the entire purpose of their visit. And when you file for a work visa, you're signing up to agree to this sort of compliance visit. But these are not law enforcement officers. And by and large, they're really looking to just verify the terms and conditions of a work visa. Now, even within the world of ICE visits, there are different kind of sub-agencies or directorates within ICE, and they themselves can have different purposes. And the one that I really want to focus on here is an ICE I-9 audit. So in an I-9 audit, as you may know, you need to complete a Form I-9 to demonstrate work authorization for all of your employees. And ICE is allowed to come on site and ask you to produce those I-9s to show that everybody's work authorized. So I'm going to talk in a little bit about not letting people into non-public spaces and, kind of having your guard up when it comes to dealing with government immigration officers. But in the case of an I-9 audit, it's important to remember that This is something that ICE is permitted to do. Normally, these audits can be triggered just randomly or by a tip or some investigation. But by and large, an I-9 audit is a paperwork process and is not really the sort of ICE audit that we typically think of in the news. ICE also obviously does do enforcement actions, and those can be raids. It can be looking for a particular person who they believe is unauthorized. And they also have HSI, which is even broader and can be looking at things like fraud, trafficking, and involved in kind of broader criminal investigations. I also, just as residents here of Western and Central New York, wanted to point out that Customs and Border Protection is also in the mix. And this is really because Customs and Border Protection has special powers within 100 miles of an international border. So, other than a very small sliver of the Adirondacks, the entire state of New York is in that 100-mile border zone. And essentially, and I have a slide on it here, the government has some extra powers in this 100-mile zone. And what that really means is beyond the authority that ICE has to investigate people they believe to not be authorized to be present in the US, CBP officers can go a little bit beyond that in this 100-mile zone. Specifically, they could board vehicles and vessels, so they could get on an Amtrak train or a Greyhound bus. They could set up an immigration checkpoint and ask people for evidence of their immigration status. So that's not something that ICE is just allowed to do anywhere in the country. But I'm just flagging it because really where we are, this is something to keep in mind and to just understand that CBP, in fact, has perhaps broader authority than ICE in our region to carry out enforcement actions and ask people about their immigration status. And yeah, just to illustrate it here, this is the 100-mile border zone. Sort of looks like a red highlighter, and just give you a sense here of how broad it really is. And it's 100 air miles from any international border, which they define as the shores of the Great Lakes, which is why it extends down as far as it does. So what I've described are federal immigration agents, right? CBP, ICE, the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. But I wanted to just pause here a little bit and talk about the role of, we hear about sanctuary cities, and to understand exactly what this means. I think some people have the sense that a sanctuary city means that people are safe in this area if they're undocumented, and that's really not exactly right. Really, it's a set policy, and this exists across central and western New York and other cities throughout the country. It's essentially a policy to not engage with immigration enforcement at the local law enforcement level. So this means that if you're pulled over for running a red light or speeding, the officer, the local police officer, should not be asking after your immigration status. They should not be inquiring about whether you have authorization to be in the U.S. Now, very importantly, these are citywide policies, and every suburb could have their own particular policy. So you really want to think about the city limits for this and what it means. But I'll also point out that a conviction for a crime does still have a notification requirement to the federal government. So really what this means is that local law enforcement in a sanctuary city should not be taking time to ask about your immigration status and to sort of coordinate that with ICE. So in the world of ICE enforcement, and this now really is kind of what we see in the headlines of ICE going out and looking for people who do not have authorization to be here and seeking to remove those people from the US. ICE has very broad authority in public spaces. And I want to pause here and define this because it's really important. ICE has the authority to be in a public space, and public spaces are spaces where people are reasonably expected to be permitted. So a good kind of analogy here is you go into a cafe and you order a coffee, right? The area where you walk in and where people are seated, this is a public space. Anybody's allowed to go in there generally, even if a business can technically refuse, certain customers. If it's a business where you can walk in off the street and go up to a counter and order a coffee, that is somewhere that ICE has the authority to be. So this extends to places like grocery stores, um, restaurants, gas stations, anywhere where you can reasonably walk in. That's a public space, and that's somewhere where ICE has the authority to be, whether or not they have permission. Now, in that cafe example, if someone were to go behind the counter to the area where they're making the lattes and, or the food storage area where the food is being prepared, those are non-public spaces. We're not generally allowed in those areas. And so if ICE wants to get into that type of space, they need one of two things. They either need permission or they need a warrant signed by a judge. Now, permission here um, can be permission from anyone who they reasonably believe is authorized to give permission. So I know in this part of the country, we're all pretty friendly, and it might be nice to hold a door for someone or to buzz someone in. But this is exactly the sort of permission that could, not actually be someone with the authority to give permission, but could give ICE the impression that they are allowed into a non-public space. So as nice as we all are, it's really important that you don't hold the door open, you don't buzz people into areas where you don't have that authority, because that could allow ICE to enter a non-public space. The other way that ICE can get into a non-public space is with a warrant signed by a judge. And we specifically here are thinking about a judicial warrant rather than an ICE warrant. And this is somewhat confusing because ICE has their own forms, which they refer to as warrants, and they are not signed by a judge. And an ICE officer might approach a dwelling or a business and say, I have a warrant here and I'd like to enter. But what's really important is to confirm whether that warrant is signed by a judge, because if it's not, it does not give them the authority to enter that non-public area. Now, there has been a little bit of back and forth about this, whether ICE has the authority to enter non-public areas if they have a final removal order for someone, meaning basically a judge has decided that someone is subject to removal. But this is kind of an ongoing issue that is not fully resolved just yet. I also want to point out here that federal agents from other agencies outside of ICE have in the past year been deputized to essentially assist ICE with immigration enforcement. So you might see this where you see a group of ICE officers in a video, and maybe there's someone there with a CBP vest, or there's someone with an FBI badge or an FBI jacket. For purposes of this analysis, really think of everybody here as ICE. What's on the badge or what's on the jacket is not quite as important as what they're doing and why they're asking to enter a particular non-public area. So to try to make sense of this, and we're thinking about what, sort of your first contact workers and trying to, this won't exactly apply perfectly to every business, but I'm hoping that you can kind of internalize this and think about what it means for you and your business. But I'd like the idea of just having someone who is the designated contact person or, first responder who is ready to address this circumstance and is prepared for, what are your public areas, what are your non-public areas, and what is your policy about letting people in to your space. And it's really important that this person can remain calm and professional. And if you're not granting permission to an ICE officer to enter a non-public space, the person can simply say that. I do not have the authority to grant you permission to access this space, but I can get you people to answer questions if you have questions or to provide information if there's something we can help with. It's important that this person not answer questions if they don't know the answer, right? If an ICE officer says, does this particular individual work at this business? It's better to just say, look, I'm not in a position of authority to answer this question, and I can't grant you permission, but we can get you in touch with someone who might be able to help. Now, here too, this might not apply in all places, but if there is a private area close to a lobby or close to where the officer is, it can be reasonable to say, look, we can let you remain in this private area for now, just to get them out of what might be a busy public area that might be causing a little bit more commotion than intended. And you can authorize someone to wait in a private lobby or a private room until you're able to get them in touch with someone who can grant or deny the permission that they're seeking. So that's sort of at a baseline for first contact workers. There are some other things that are quite helpful, but are absolutely not required. And this is basically if the person has time and feels safe to do so, it can be very, very helpful in ICE enforcement actions to have details about what happened. Sometimes things happen very quickly. Sometimes it's hard to verify this information, like the agent's identity. But if your first contact workers can kind of have this checklist of here's the information that you should be gathering, it can be very helpful down the line. So asking for the agent's identity, what agency are they with? Do they have a badge number that they can provide? Do they have contact information that you can collect? Documenting exactly why they are there at the business. Sometimes they have documents. It might be that they produce that ICE warrant that's not actually a judicial warrant. If you're able to make a copy of that, that's wonderful. And again, it's not about impeding the visit in any way, but simply to gather information and make sure that you have a clear record of exactly who was there, what they were asking after, and what possible next steps might come up. The other thing that's optional is to record the interaction, right? And this could be video if the person feels comfortable to do so, or it could even just be writing down notes as soon as the interaction is over, where the person can say, look, here's exactly what happened. Here's, to the best of my recollection, a transcript of the conversation that occurred. And again, this is not to impede, but simply to document the interaction so that you have a good sense moving forward of whether there's anything else that's needed or whether things went how they should have gone. So just to talk through, and I'm saying U.S. immigration officials here, but really we're thinking again about ICE in the context of enforcement or CBP in that 100-mile border zone. What does it look like when they interact with individuals in a public setting? Now, if an immigration official asks for someone's documentation, if they say, we need to see your papers, basically, the person is obligated to provide those documents unless they are a U.S. citizen. And this sort of dovetails with a rule that was put in place in April of last year. Well, actually, it was an older rule, but the enforcement was ramped up a little bit in April of 2025, that anyone who's not a citizen of the U.S. is required to carry proof of their what's called registration, which is essentially their valid status in the U.S. So they might have an employment authorization document. There's something called a Form I-94, which shows someone's valid status and expiration date in the U.S. So generally speaking, if an ICE officer asks for these documents, the person is supposed to provide them. And the exception here is a U.S. citizen. So the visa holder, or if there's a reason why they don't have valid papers or they don't want to provide them, you can invoke your right to remain silent. Somewhat counterintuitively, you have to say it out loud and clearly state, I am invoking my right to remain silent. And you can say that you'd like to consult a lawyer. Now, this is a very deeply personal decision to make, and I don't want to sit here and say I recommend that everybody invoke the right to remain silent or that you should never invoke this right. It's a very personal decision to make based on the individual circumstances of your case and how you feel about it and what rights you're choosing to invoke in that particular circumstance. What I can say is if you invoke the right to remain silent and you did not provide the documents to an ICE officer, I think it's reasonable to expect that that would lead to further questioning and possible detention. But it's, again, not to take a side here and say there's one right or wrong answer, but these are sort of the parameters of a visit with an immigration officer in a public setting. So if someone is detained by ICE, there's a few important things to keep in mind. One is the person might not have access to their cell phone, even temporarily. And when you're detained in ICE custody, electronic devices are confiscated and held for you. So we really recommend that people memorize the phone number for an emergency contact, someone who can kind of know exactly what else to do. If there's an immigration lawyer, the emergency contact should be able to get in touch with them. If there are children that need childcare or to be picked up from school, or there's a medication that's required, having one emergency contact where you can just memorize that phone number and that person knows that they're your person, that's a really, really helpful planning tool if this does come up, just because of the logistics of ICE detention. It is also helpful to carry evidence of your valid immigration status if you have it. This is a little specific, but if someone entered the U.S. without inspection, which means they didn't cross at a standard land border crossing, it's helpful to include evidence that they were physically present in the U.S. for the last 2 years, if that's applicable. And that relates to something called expedited removal and can help kind of defend against that. So I know that's very specific. Now, these other documents here, I would say, are helpful if the person has a real reason to expect ICE detention. If, for example, they are aware that they're undocumented and they don't have valid status, they might carry a G-28, which is a form that a lawyer uses to enter their appearance on someone's behalf with the Immigration Service. And you might also complete an ICE privacy waiver, which could allow a congressional representative, for example, to advocate on someone's behalf. I'm not suggesting that anyone on a work visa should carry these documents at all times, but I would say if you have a heightened risk of detention, these can be helpful things to plan for as well. And again, I don't think that every visa holder should necessarily contact an immigration lawyer, but if you have something that gives a little bit more reason for pause, such as a prior criminal conviction, or you know that you entered without inspection and you don't have valid status, it's probably good to connect with not just an immigration attorney, but a removal defense attorney, because that's the sort of person that could help you out if you are detained or arrested, and time is absolutely of the essence in those cases. So a question we often get is, well, what if ICE is breaking the rules or might be breaking the rules? And this, I think, gets back to kind of that first line contact worker. And, what happens if you say, hey, I'm not giving you permission to enter this space, and they push past you? The key thing here is safety first, right? You never want to physically engage or obstruct an officer. And just to point it out, there can be reasons why the officer might have, authority to enter a space that that is a non-public area. An example is if they are chasing someone who's fleeing the scene of a crime or there's an emergency. There can be other carve-outs to the normal Fourth Amendment protections. And so you don't always know exactly what's going on, especially if things happen quickly. So never physically engage or obstruct a government officer. And while you can clearly state that you're not giving them permission, here too, just you can't physically block people. This is just, not a good idea for the business, for the individual. But it gets back to that recording the interaction if it's safe to do so, and or taking notes if it's not safe to actually record what's happening. So to turn the focus a little bit here and just talk through some compliance issues for U.S. visa holders. As I've said, we really recommend that anybody who's here and is not a U.S. citizen carry evidence of their valid status at all times. It could be a printout of, an I-94. It doesn't necessarily have to be the original. Now, for green card holders, they are supposed to carry the actual physical green card. But I would not rely on an electronic record of immigration documents stored on a phone, for example. I think it's really important to have a hard copy printout with you. Notifying the Immigration Service of address changes. This is something that was not a huge deal years ago, but in the past year and a half, this has really become more of a hot button issue. Technically, you're required to update the Immigration Service of an address change within 10 days if you're here on a work visa. And doing that promptly ensures that you stay in compliance and doesn't give anyone a reason to suspect that you have violated an immigration law. Different work visas allow you to do different things, right? I mean, we have student visas for international students, and a student visa doesn't allow you necessarily to start your own business, right? We have visas that allow you to start your own business that don't necessarily allow you to work for another company. So the point here is if someone is on a work visa, it's a great time to be mindful of the parameters of that work visa and to think about what it allows and what it does not allow. It is not a great time to be creative and test the limits of what's possible on a particular work visa. Another thing we're seeing come up quite a bit in just the past couple months is a real focus on social media. So we're seeing this at consulates outside the US when people go to apply for a visa stamp. We're also seeing it now in the US when people apply for benefit requests. So for example, applying for work authorization or applying for an EAD or a green card. The government can and may kind of take a look at your social media posts. And at consulates now, they're actually asking people to set their social media accounts to public rather than keeping them private. Again, I'm not here to recommend a particular course of action, but just to help understand the landscape of what's going on. And I hope that people are aware that, social media is something that an immigration officer could look at. Now, this is something that applies to everyone, regardless of your citizenship status. Electronic device searches at the border, Customs and Border Protection, CBP, has broader authority to search devices. And this includes U.S. citizens. It actually includes people departing or entering the U.S. But I think it's just a good time to practice some kind of digital hygiene and make sure that when you are traveling internationally, you're aware of this and prepared for it. So technically, officers are not supposed to search data that's only on the cloud, but with phones these days, that's a little bit harder to parse out in practice, especially with things like photos that might be stored on the phone's hard drive, but also, backed up in the cloud. It's a little bit more of a blurry line. Setting your phone to airplane mode can turn off access to the cloud, so that's a reasonable thing to do. Now, if your phone is protected with a passcode, you do not have to give that passcode to CBP. But if your phone is set up with a biometric device to open it, like fingerprint or a Face ID, the officer can make you open the device for them. So if the officer wants to detain your device as a U.S. citizen, you could continue on into the U.S. and they have some period of time that they're supposed to return it to you. And basically, they could keep it to try to unlock it on their own. Um, but again, this is a really personal decision about if an officer is asking to review your phone. You should know that you don't have to unlock it for them unless it's a biometric locking mechanism, and they might keep it for a while. So from my side, as an attorney with sensitive client information on my phone. When I travel, I either take a different phone with me or I make sure to put it on airplane mode, turn off Face ID, and set it up in a way where I'm comfortable that if an officer needs to detain the device, they're not going to be accessing client information. Finally, just again for visa holders thinking about travel restrictions and international travel specifically, we are just generally recommending that visa holders remain in the US right now as much as possible. And the simple reason for this is that it's a lot easier for us to protect people's status if they're here in the country rather than outside the US trying to come back in. US consulates, they don't really have an appeal process. So if you don't get a decision that you like at a consulate, there's not always a great way to go back and give them more evidence or have the person get another shot at getting a visa. It's much easier to protect someone's status when they're here in the country. And so understanding this isn't always possible, just if people are able to remain here right now, it's a reasonably good idea to do so. So let's see. And with that, just wanted to open it up and allow some time for questions here. I hope this wasn't too much of a death by PowerPoint, but hopefully there was some helpful information in there as well.
Thank you very much, Glenn. I am going to go ahead and pause the recording just so that folks can have an opportunity to speak without being recorded. So if you would like to ask a question, you can go ahead and unmute and ask your question.